So we're going to start talking about the cerebrum, and I want to start this by telling you three key structures that you will see in the brain. The first one is the sulcus, the second one is the gyrus, and in a second I will show you the fissures, and all of them are elevations or grooves or furrows. Yeah, all of those folds are very important in the brain because similar to the cerebellum, it will allow to increase the surface area of the brain and to pack more neurons for processing in the cortex of the brain. So here, so the sulcus is a furrow, while the opposite is a gyrus, that is an elevation. And in between both, the left and right hemisphere, you have the fissure, that is a deeper sulcus that is separating these two structures. So I told you there were three key terminology that you need to understand to remember that we will be using to describe the brain, that are gyri, fissures, and sulci. They are located in the cortex of the brain. I told you that if you see here, the gyri or gyrus are a ridge-like elevation, while the sulcus is a groove or is a furrow that is especially found in the surface of the brain. And finally, that in between the two hemispheres, as you can see in the purple line that it separates both hemispheres, you will have a fissure that is a deep groove that separates the two hemispheres. Okay, just to recap, I'm going to tell you that the gray and white matter have a different distribution in the cerebrum, and it will be different from the spinal cord. So if you remember, the white matter will be inside in the cerebrum, yeah, in the deep cortex. While the gray matter, you can see it outside in the cortex of the cerebrum. Yeah, yeah. So here, all this is a gray matter. You can also find a lot of nuclei here that later we will talk in more detail. On the other hand, in the spinal cord, you see the opposite distribution. You see the white matter outside. So you see it here, surrounded this H shape, that it will be gray matter, yeah, that it will be inside. So again, is they have an opposite distribution. So just as a reminder, I told you in this slide that the gray matter in the brain is located in the cerebral cortex, and you have there billions of neurons. On the other hand, the white matter is located in the deep cortex, so inside of the cerebrum, and there you will have a lot of tracks that connect the brain. Yeah, each one of the regions of the brain will be connected by those tracks. The cerebellum to the cerebrum, to the brainstem, to the diencephalon, all these structures. And of course, they will connect with the spinal cord. Now we're going to talk about the corpus callosum. That is an example of bundles of white matter, and so you can find it here above the ventricle. And those white matter tracks are connecting the right and the left hemisphere. So here you can see them connecting each one of those hemispheres. In this slide, we're going to talk about the anatomical details of the cerebral cortex, and to do that, your book has these two pretty diagrams. The first one gives us the superior view of the cerebrum, and here, this area, the textbook zoom in to try to show us the different gyruses and fissures and all the different faults that they happen in that area. Okay, so let's start talking about these anatomical details. So here in the superior view, you can see that there is something happening in the anterior part. Here there is another anatomical difference in the middle and another one in the most posterior. So the one in the most anterior is called frontal lobe. the one that is, and it goes from the most anterior part to this area to almost the center, that you have these sulcus here. And later we have the second region, the blue region, that is the parietal lobe. And finally, the last section is the occipital lobe, that is the one in green. Now let's see the different areas here, the different folds, how they are called. So here, if you see, here we have a deep a group here. So in number one, we have a group that going in longitudinal direction. So this will be called longitudinal cerebral fissure because it's a deep groove. Then number two, here you have an elevation. So here you have an elevation. So this will be a gyrus. And remember, this is before the center. Yeah, this will be before the center. So this will be a precentral gyrus. And the third one here, it will be this. This is not going to be anymore uh, an elevation. This will be a group. So this will be, and it will be in the center. So it will be called central cerebral sulcus. Finally, now we are going to move into these four regions, and here this is again a gyrus, just an elevation, but it goes after, yeah, post the gyrus, so it's called post central gyrus. Okay, so we cover the three regions, the three lobes of the brain. Then we talk about the names of the different folds, how they're given based on the presence of this center division between the parietal and frontal lobe. And now we're going to focus on this second diagram where we zoom in. And here you see again, this is not a superficial group, this is a deep group. And this one will be this longitudinal cerebral fissure that we saw in the beginning. So here this will be number one. It will be the longitudinal cerebral fissure. Now here in sorry here number two, we have this cerebral gyrus because this is at elevation. Number three, here we have a group, so this will be a cerebrum sulcus here, yeah, because it's a group. Number four, here they are not pointing anymore at the groups or the elevations, they are pointing at this orange area. Yeah, and this area will be the cortex. And inside of the cortex, in this very clear, much clearer area that is deeper, you will find the cerebral white matter. So here we went through all the different details of the cerebral cortex, and I show you now. Hopefully, you can remember and you can start putting together these different details of the anatomy. Now here we can see from the lateral view the different lobes again. So I already told you that when we go from the superior view, you can see the front lobe. You can see also the parietal lobe that is located here. We talk about this post-central gyrus. We talk about this central cerebral sulcus that divided the two of them. Here you can see the division of the prior to occipital sulcus that divide this region, and here you can see the occipital lobe. But there are regions that we cannot see. So, for example, the temporal here, this third one, we cannot see it, and here we cannot not see this one. Let's put a 5 here. That is the insular lobe or insula. And here, if you see, this one is inside of the brain, so we just project it to the surface, but it's located there. And so here, for example, between the cerebellum, we will have another fissure here that is the we talked before, that is transverse cerebral fissure, and we will have all these structures that separate each one of the lobes of the brain. So here I told you that the brain can be divided in 5 lobes. First one, frontal lobe, the most anterior. Parietal lobe, that is superior in the middle. Temporal lobe, that is inferior to other lobes, close to the cerebellum. Here, the occipital one, that is the most posterior and inferior. And finally, the insular lobe, that it will be inside all of the cerebrum. So now we're going to talk about the cerebral white matter tracts. And there are 3 types. So the first type is here, the association tracts. Second type is here in blue, the commissural tract. And the third type is here, the commissural and projection tracts. So these 3 types, they're axons of white matter that connect different regions of the brain. So let me put the first one, the ones that are in yellow. If you see, these axons are connecting different regions of the cerebrum, but they belong, and let me put it in black, so to the same hemisphere. Okay, so different areas of the cerebrum, but uh, from the same hemisphere. Okay, the second one, and now I'm going to change to blue, is the commissural tracts. So here, for example, we have an example that is the corpus callosum. And if you remember, this corpus callosum, it connect or is form of white tracts that connect, and let me put it in blue, different hemispheres. Yeah, so this one will connect the hemisphere, the right with the left. Okay, and finally, we have the third type of commissural tracts. So these ones that are here, and this one will connect to other regions of the brain. So other regions of the brain. So, yeah, so they can go here to the diencephalon, to the midbrain, to the cerebellum, etc. Okay, so now let's recap all the information that I gave you. I told you there are 3 types of cerebral white matter tracts. Yeah, and I told you that the first one are the association tracts that are connecting different areas of the brain, but of the same hemisphere. Then I told you that there is the commissural tracts, that they cross the midline and they connect the opposite areas of the hemisphere. So they connect the left and the right hemisphere. And finally, I told you about the projection tracts or commissural tracts, and those one, they connect the cortex of the cerebrum with other areas of the central nervous system, like the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, etc. So in the previous slide, we were talking about white matter. Now we're going to talk about gray matter, and here this is called basal nuclei or basal ganglia. And what is a basal ganglia? Is not other than cluster of gray matter. And here in your textbook, they show you all these different clusters of gray matter. If you want to see the names, you can find it in your textbook. I just didn't want to make this more complicated. So in each one of the hemisphere, you will find this concentration, this cluster of gray matter that they will connect the cerebral cortex, thalamus, hypothalamus, midbrain, etc. So all of them will have this basal nuclei. And the primary function here, so let's write the function of this, will include motor control. Also, it could be motor learning. It could also be execution of functions. It could be also emotions. Yeah, and there will be many more functions, but this is the main idea is that. So let's recap with the main idea. that I told you that the structure of the location of the basal ganglia, that the basal ganglia are just nuclei, that they're a cluster of gray matter, and they are located in each hemisphere. I also told you that they connect several areas of the brain, and these one are all the different areas that they are connected by these basal nuclei. In addition to that, I told you that the function include a lot of motor control, motor learning, executive functions, as well as emotion. And there are more, you can find them in your textbook. If you remember, in the beginning of the class and in the previous chapter, we have been talking about how neurons, how impulses travel through the central nervous system, and that, for example, we have sensory receptors that are very important. We have other type of neurons that are in charge of associating all these functions and different organs, and as well as a response, yeah, as a motor response of that. So the cerebrum has a function in each one of those. So for example, right now you are receiving some signals, you're listening to a lecture, and your brain is processing the information and is sending it to different parts of your central nervous system that is going to create different impulses, and then it's going to create a motor response, and this is why you're taking notes. Now in the following slides we're going to see what parts, what regions of the brain, of the cortex of the brain, will be in charge of sensory processes, or ones in association, and what are the regions of the cortex that are in form of motor functions. Now we're going to talk about the functional areas of the cerebral cortex, and as I said before, we can classify it into three functional areas, and this will be a simplification. Later we will talk in more detail about this, but there are motor areas, and as an example that you have this area of the cortex that is highlighted there in blue, that is called primary motor cortex, and is in charge of the control of voluntary movements. In addition to that, we have the sensory areas, and an example of that is the sensory cortex, and is in charge of conscious awareness of sensations. And finally, the third one, the association areas, is we have areas that integrate diverse information, and here you will find multiple areas that we will show you in the following picture. So this is a more detailed picture of the different functional areas. However, it's the same idea. Here you have three functional areas. So for example, you have associated or integrative functions here, or here the somatosensory association area. They were the two things that I didn't show you in the previous one. But if you go and look in each one of them, you would find some of them that are involved in sensation, or ones that are in responses, in motor responses, and other ones in the association. In addition to those one, if you remember the insula, we will have other regions of the brain or functional areas that you just have to open the brain, and let me show you that in the following slide. So here in your textbook they show you that if you open the the brain, you can see inside that you will find in the insula that we said that it was inside, and you can also find the olfactory and gustatory cortex. So again, all this information can be divided, they can be grouped into three main classifications: that motor, sensory, and association. So now let's talk in more detail about these motor areas. And the first thing that you can see here is the location. So when we talk about the location of the motor areas, so they will be in the frontal lobe. Yeah, so they will be anterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so first is the location. Second thing, let's think about the functions. So the functions of the motor area, they are pretty easy. Yeah, to remember, they are sending signals, And where they're sending those signals, they are sending signals to the effectors that are the muscles, so the skeletal muscles. And so they will be in charge of creating this contraction and these voluntary movements. Okay, so I told you about the location, that is the frontal lobe, the function that is send signals to the skeletal muscles, and now we're going to talk about the sub areas. And in the diagram, you can see easily the three sub areas. The first, premotor cortex. Here you can see the supplementary motor area, and the third one that they will be the primary motor cortex. Now let's recap all the information that I told you. So I told you that the function is the initiation and control of voluntary skeletal muscle contraction. So they generate the signal to send it to the skeletal muscles to produce a response. Also, I told you that the location is they are located in the frontal lobe, so they are anterior to the central sulcus. And I told you there were three sub areas that are here, and those one are color coded there in the picture. So now we're going to make a little parenthesis to try to understand, okay, how we are able to understand all these sensory and motor areas. And in your textbook, they talk about this homunculus, this little main in your brain. And I just remind you, if you haven't taken genetic revolution, imagine that in the past, centuries ago, we thought that in the sperm, when we had the first microscope, we thought that there was a little main inside of our sperm. So in other words, you will have a tiny human there. Yeah, so we don't know how development occurs, how morphogenesis takes place. So we don't know anything about meiosis, yeah, that you have two gametes that interchange DNA. Nothing of that was already available. So the first people that was start using microscope, they thought that they saw little men, and in that way they thought, okay, so we have very tiny humans inside of the sperm, and after conception they start growing. So this metaphor was useful to create this metaphor about how the brain works. So now we know that the homunculus is not doesn't exist, but it inspired this idea. So it's an experiment that this that took place in the 1930s. This idea of the little main in your brain, and is based on the homunculus metaphor. And what they did there is try to map the brain. And how they map the brain? So they use direct electrical stimulation in awake patients. So they, for example, put an electrode here, and the person moved the leg. So they said, "Oh, this is for movement." Then they move it in another place, and the person start, I don't know, crying, suppose, yeah, say, oh, this could be related to emotion. And in that way they start uh, trying to test the different functions of different areas of the brain. Has advantage, have disadvantage, but is something based on that is historical, yeah, that is in the history of how we understand the brain. And it's still in your textbook, and there is a lot of new tech tools that have improved this area of research. But it's important that you know that this exists. So here you find two diagrams, one of the brain cortex, and here is the homunculus. That this is how they used to teach it, not what the scientists proposed, but it was a tool for people to understand what happened. So here, what happened here is that large areas of your brain, yeah, like they were involved, for example, in the sensation, like the taste, like the sensation of your hands, your facial movements. Well, large portion of our bodies, like our legs, our trunk, they represent a very small portion of our cortex. Yeah. So if we made a human, imaginary human, that this is the way that a nurse trying to explain this topic use as a teaching tool. So like that the human, if we take the cortex of the brain and we create a human based on those proportions, you will have a human with really big hands, really big tongue because there is a lot of neurons involved in the sensation of touching, of tasting, also in the vision, etc. While other portion of the body, they will be much smaller, like our trunk and our leg. So in our word, this cortical homunculus, sorry, is a distorted representation of a human body based on a neurological map of the areas of the human brain. Okay, so let me recap the information that I just told you. So I told you that here you can see a three-dimensional representation of the homunculus, and this is showing what happened if a man grew in proportion of the cortex of the areas of the cortex of the brain. So we'll have really big hands, yeah, and very big mouth, yeah, because there is a lot of parts of the cortex of the brain that are involved in that area. And what is the cortical homunculus? Is a distorted representation of the human body based on this neurological map that I told you before. If you want to know more, in your textbook they have more information, and I'm going to show you some diagrams that are shown in your textbook that they follow exactly the same idea that I just explained here. So here in your textbook they gave you again a similar diagram showing you different parts of the body like the foot, the legs, the hip, the trunk, and in which part of the gyrus they will be located. So here, this is a sensory homunculus, and remember, this is a specific location in the postcentral gyrus. Something similar they show you with the motor homunculus. So here they have a similar representation of the motor homunculus, and here they show you again each one of the parts of the body and how big it will, or how big is the area that it will be required for the movement of that part of the body. Okay, with that we finished the parenthesis of the homunculus, yeah, the how we create a homunculus of the cortex of the brain, and this monster that we show you. Now we go back into these functional areas of the cortex of the brain, and we move into the sensory areas again. So when we talk about the sensory areas, uh, are areas of the brain that are in charge of receiving and processing sensory information. And we have, if you see, a wide variety of processes from sight to receptors of touching. So we can divide it into groups, yeah, into some of them that have that are somatic sense, like things that happen in your skin. Like for example, you have receptors that are involved in the pressure that are pressure sensitive, or ones that are temperature sensitive, or one that detect pain, all of them located in different parts of your body. You also have special senses that are like hearing, taste, vision, smell. All of those one are special senses. So the sensory areas, you will have general somatic senses, and you will also have special senses. Now we're going to finish talking about the associated areas. And first thing that we need to talk is about the location. And to do that, we have the diagram below that show in blue the two areas that are here. There are more, as I showed you before, but here we have the prefrontal associating area, and this one that have a very long name, parietal, occipital, temporal associating area. And if you see, is closely related to motor areas. Why? Because, and this is related to the function of these areas of the cortex of the cerebrum, they are receiving inputs from multiple areas. So they can receive sensory information, yeah, and so they receive that information and they can connect it with motor information. So in other words, all this information that go from multiple regions of the cortex of the brain, of the of the cortex of the cerebrum or the brain, they are able to receive it and to connect it to produce a response. Now let's go and recap all the information that I told you about this last functional area. So I told you that the location of the associated area are shown in this schematic in blue, and besides that you can also find primary and secondary motor areas, because as we talked before, the functional areas are a part of the cortex that receive input from multiple areas. So it could be sensory, yeah, so they integrate these sensory areas and they connect it to the sensory and motor areas. So this is why you have some of those motor primary and secondary motor areas close there. Now let's talk about the associated areas of the cerebral cortex and the functions. They could be related to intelligence, judgment, reasoning, and logic. In addition to that, they could be the interpretation of verbal and written language. And here you have a diagram that shows you that associated area can be involved in each one of these ones. So from encoding the information and processing and consolidating that to storage and retrieval of the information. So all of these ones will be related to these associated areas of the cerebral cortex. Now I'm going to show you a video that summarizes all this information, so hopefully it's easier for you to understand it.
The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain. It is primarily made up of gray matter that is extensively folded, forming ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. The folding substantially increases the surface area of the cerebral cortex, making room for more neural components. Most of the cerebral cortex in humans is classified as neocortex, which is so named because it is thought to have appeared relatively recently in vertebrate evolution. Neurons in the neocortex are typically arranged in 6 layers, which are distinguished from one another by differences in cell type and cell density. The rest of the cerebral cortex is made up of either allocortex, which has a more variable pattern of layering, or mesocortex, which is a transition area between the neocortex and allocortex. Although attempts to functionally subdivide the cerebral cortex tend to oversimplify its functions, one common approach is to divide the cortex into sensory areas, motor areas, and association areas. Sensory areas receive information related to sensation and include regions like the primary somatosensory cortex, which processes information about sensations like touch, pain, and temperature, primary visual cortex, and primary auditory cortex, as well as other areas devoted to sensations like olfaction, taste, and the vestibular senses. The motor areas of the cerebral cortex are involved with movement and include regions like the primary motor cortex, premotor cortex, and supplementary motor cortex. Association areas are involved in the integration of information from multiple brain regions. This integration can do things like add complexity to sensory perceptions or facilitate higher cognitive processes. For example, the association areas in the parietal cortex are thought to be involved with aspects of attention and perceptual awareness, and association areas in the frontal cortex are linked to complex processes like planning, impulse control, and self-awareness.